Hello. It is my pleasure to be here today with Marta Viegas as we discuss global governance perspectives in Latin America and beyond. Now, we are in for a real treat to have Marta today because her background is so incredibly impressive. And I want to make sure I get this right, Marta. So I'm actually going to read your bio. She's an alternate member of the Board of Executive Directors for Brazil and Suriname, the Inter-American Development Bank, the IDB, Inter-American Investment Corporation, the IDB Investments, and Donors Committee of the Multilateral Investment Fund, the IDB Lab. She's also the former head of corporate governance, lead officer at IDB Invest. And of course, without saying this, she's an active member of the WCD Brazil chapter. So we are so thrilled to have you with us today, Marta. We know you're going to share with us some great perspectives with our audience. So if it's okay, I'd like to just kick it off with the question, Marta. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your work at the Inter-American Development Bank, okay?
Hello, Cindy, and thank you so much for this kind introduction. It humbles me. And of course, I'm delighted to participate in this podcast. I'm a big fan of WCD and all the work it does. And as you said, I'm a member of the Board of Executive Directors of IDB. And for those who don't know what the IDB is, it's a multilateral development bank, or what we call it an MDB. And it's different. It's a bank, but it's different from other commercial banks because its primary mandate is to foster development, a positive development impact in the region that it operates in. In our case, the IDB, that region is Latin America and the Caribbean. So it's a bank. It needs to be financially sustainable, of course, but it's maximizing development impact. Its main objective. And I have to say, just before we start, I have to say that in this podcast, I'm speaking on my own personal capacity as an executive director, as a governance professional, but not speaking on behalf of the IDB. But in terms of background, I'm a governance expert and I'm a lawyer. I've been most of my career advising international investors doing business in Latin America and the Caribbean. I think first I started as a corporate lawyer, M&A lawyer in my home country, Brazil. And from there, I migrated into advising institutional investors, companies, and the boards on good corporate governance practices all over Latin America and the Caribbean. And I also took a few board seats myself. I've worked in, as I said, most of the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. I would say I worked in about 26 countries. And from the big countries like Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, Mexico, Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile, and smaller countries like Jamaica, Suriname, Guyana, Barbados, Bahamas, and also Haiti is a challenging environment there. But that's a little bit about me.
Well, that's quite a lot about you, actually, Marta. You have an incredible background and just great experience. One of the things that's really interesting is Latin America, like so many regions around the globe, has really been challenged by inflation, economic instability. I mean, it's not unique to Latin America, but I'd be interested in, with your corporate governance background, how do you think that kind of strong differentiator, can that be a differentiator, if you will, for companies, having a strong corporate governance program in place in light of, maybe fragile economic conditions?
It does make a difference. And I have, I see it. I see it every day, how good corporate governance really makes a difference in company. But taking a step back, when we look at Latin America and the Caribbean, just as, other emerging economies, we have to consider them within the global landscape. And I think at this moment, there's no shortage of challenges in the global landscape. We're dealing with geopolitical tensions, the shifts in global trade, the climate crisis, rapid development of AI. All of those things bring its own set of implications. And for Latin America and the Caribbean, there are deeply rooted and persistent issues like economic instability, inflation, high levels of inequalities, social challenges. And of course, I would have to say environmental degradation is a growing threat. And all this is only intensified by the global dynamics, right? And I think it's worth emphasizing that Latin America and the Caribbean is one of the most climate vulnerable regions in the world. It has seen severe droughts, devastating floods, extreme weather events, and all that pose serious risks for industries like agribusiness and tourism and many others. But, I would say alongside the challenges, there are immense opportunities. And I want to mention, the region holds over 40% of the planet's biodiversity, 57% of primary forests. It's the world's largest food exporting region. It's responsible for 40% of the global food trade, and it possesses nearly 60% of the global lithium reserves, which is essential recourse for sustainable energy transition. So, there's challenges, but there's also immense opportunities, and a role of the IDB as a development bank is to mobilize, to bring private investment into that region. And, investors, there is investment interest of foreign institutional investors, but they can be risk averse, particularly when we speak about reputational risk. And this is exactly where corporate governance plays a critical role. Investors may be willing to take a higher contextual risk in exchange for potential higher returns, but of course they will prioritize working with companies that demonstrate strong governance, transparency, reliability. So when you ask me, what boards can do, my answer is very straightforward. A board that really champions corporate governance, that board puts the company in much a stronger position to attract investors and potentially lowering the cost of capital. And of course, beyond that, we all know that the other benefits of corporate governance in terms of a relationship with stakeholders, enhancing operational performance, improving resilience to external shocks, etc. All that is very important in this context that we're living.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear you say that, because I think it is critical. I mean, as a board member, boards work with management. They help guide them in terms of, they don't do managers' work, as you know, but they do oversee it. So, you touched on that briefly. Is there anything specifically that a board member or boards can do with management to help them be able to illustrate to investors, to the world, this is a stable place to invest. We've got strong corporate governance here. We've got all the right things in place. What could a board member do to help management in that way? And particularly if management's maybe not thinking about that in the sense that a board member might be from attracting investment. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, Marta.
I think the board can help management first to align strategic vision with the operational performance. Aligning strategy and the management and performance is one of the things that the board can do to give the notion that the company is really knows where it wants to go, and implements that in a way that resonates stability. I think investors really, what they want is stability, is to trust the companies that they're investing in. So, aligning the strategic vision with the operations, including and communicating that very well, is something that management, that the board can really helps management to put forward.
That's great. Speaking of investors and stakeholders, Certainly here in the US and also in the EU, you've just seen increased engagement, if you will. They're much more vocal in public. I'd be curious, are you seeing that in Latin America as well? And if so, what are some of the key issues that they are being vocal about, and how are boards reacting to that?
Mhm. Well, I have been seeing this. Investors have become much more vocal, much more public. But the way that this translates in Latin America, it's a little different if you compare to other developed markets, like particularly the US or the UK. You have to understand that capital markets in Latin America and the Caribbean are much smaller. They're shallower than in developed markets, like we're talking about the US and the UK. And so, the kind of shareholder activism that we find in this market is not as prominent as it is in Latin America. It can, of course, occur, but it's usually a response to a rights violation rather than, fostering a specific agenda. I think in the region, most of the companies have a defined controlling shareholder or controlling shareholder group. So minority investors in this context tend to make their voices heard by engaging in direct conversation with that controlling shareholder. But where I clearly see this unfolding, activism unfolding in Latin America and the Caribbean is with civil society. So there's a very important and influential NGOs, community-based organizations, advocacy groups, and they raise issues for public discussions, and they engage with companies about their impact with the communities they operate. The issues often range around a social nature with a focus on the well-being of workers, a surrounding community, which is not surprising given the region's inequality. And there's also a focus in preventing, reverting deforestation. And so companies that don't have or have are perceived as contributing to deforestation in any way can face significant reputational issues. But again, this is not the same kind of shareholder investor type of activism that you see in markets where capital markets are more developed.
You see in the US, it's certainly been happening in the last few years, social issues, companies, they're pressured to react. They're pressured to make a public statement. The CEOs are pressured to make public statements. It's always a debate in the boardroom as to, is that a good idea? Is it not a good idea? Is this expected in Latin America that you do opine that the CEO or the lead director, the chairman of the board, comments on these kinds of social issues? Is that a topic in the boardroom?
It is a topic. I think it's becoming much more say the word here, much more obvious as a topic than it was in the past. It is taking much more prominence in the boardroom and upper management. I would say, especially in countries like Brazil. Brazil will host the next climate conference, the next COP. So, I think social and environmental and climate issues have been more prominent in board discussions, especially in Brazil and in other countries. But I believe it's not evenly widespread in the market. It's very hard to generalize. I think there has been recent backlash in the U.S. on climate issues, for example, and this may influence companies in the region to drift away from the agenda. But I would say that the largest, the more sophisticated companies are making more progress and have this much more clear as a board agenda. But I can also see many companies usually having a hard time balancing priorities, tending to focus on a more tactical or nearsighted agenda because they need to survive the ups and downs in the economy. And being on survival mode, it makes it harder to focus on the long term or take a more vocal position on these issues. So, I'd say it's hard to generalize, but there's also one thing that I want to mention. It's there's an interesting statistics in the 2024 Global Risk Report of the World Economic Forum. And that statistic shows that the perception of urgency in relation to climate and environmental and social issues can vary significantly among younger and older executives. So younger executives tend to rank these issues much more highly in the in the short term, over a 2-year period, and older age executives tend to consider environment, climate, and social issues much more in the long term. So that is also interesting data to work with, that it's maybe a growing trend if you consider older and younger executives. But again, I think it varies a lot, and it's a big region, and small companies and big companies, so it can vary a lot.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, you think about it, even on a Maslow scale, right? Those who are trying to just make ends meet and survive, so to speak, aren't necessarily going to opine and get engaged in issues that are considered not day-to-day critical to their survival needs.
Exactly.
So, I'd like to switch gears a little bit. Obviously, WCD is interested in women being on boards, and I'd be curious from your perspective in Latin America how diversity is viewed, how active of recruitment and I guess engagement around getting additional females on boards. How do you think that is going right now in Latin America? Do you feel like there's progress? Do you feel like it's in its infancy? I mean, you're incredibly experienced and have had a lot of opportunity to view that. And I'd just be curious what you're seeing right now.
Yeah, and it's a topic that I'm very passionate about. But I would say, there has been progress, but the pace is still kind of slow. I think, and now we're seeing some backlash again coming from the U.S. on gender diversity policies. It has become a politicized subject, although it's never supposed to be politicized. No? It's a way to increase the range and the depth of board discussions.
Has that spread to Latin America as well, Marta?
Um,
Is it
again, I think in some countries, in some companies, some market it has, but again, I haven't seen that as clearly. But I would say that there has been progress, but I would say still slow. The most recent report that I read about gender and diversity in the board is the ISS report of 2024, and it shows, of course, covering the countries that ISS covers. But it shows a gender diversity remaining low. It ranges between, I think, 12.6% in Mexico to 24.9% in Colombia. And Brazil, my home country, the largest market in the region, has a modest average of 16.1% of women in publicly traded boards, right? So there has been some regional regulations on board diversity. We may improve the scenario. So we've seen regulations in Colombia, in Brazil, in Argentina. There's voluntary listing segments. In Mexico, corporate governance code, all that put emphasis on more gender and more diversity in the boards. But again, the pace has been slow, and I don't know if if the regulations will help to pick this up. What I would say is that I think education and mentoring has been, I think, so far the most effective tool in improving board diversity. And I want to mention the WCD Brazil chapter has really a wonderful mentoring program together with the Brazilian Institute of Corporate Governance and other institutions. So I think where I've seen success in progressing the agenda is been in education and in mentoring.
Yeah. That kind of to that end, if you were, I'm just curious, if you were advising a female to look at a board, what questions would you have them ask in terms of management, in terms of around leadership and culture to determine, is this a good fit for me? As I evaluate boards, as one evaluates boards rather, what what kind of questions do you ask to be able to assess leadership, culture, all of those, even when you're joining a board? But not only that, Marta, after you're there, kind of, I assume it's the same in Latin America as is in the States. You can't really your strategy can't be implemented if your culture is not right. The old, Drucker culture eats strategy for breakfast kind of thing. So I'd be
Mhm.
curious in terms of how you assess that and what questions that individuals may ask.
Yeah, I think before entering the board, it's important to kind of know what kind of company is this, because you have the publicly traded largest companies, but you have a great number of smaller company, mid-sized companies, and they're oftentimes family-owned companies that have a family as a controlling shareholder, but also all the investors or private equity investors there. So trying to understand who owns the company and how and how that ownership, well, what is the dynamic of that ownership? It's important so you understand what can you do as a board member, and how you participate in that dynamic, and how can you influence really the board. So first understanding where you're stepping into, right? And second, I think I couldn't agree more with your point on culture. I think the important questions to ask, it's first, of course, about strategy alignment, strategy, vision, and how the current strategy align with long-term goals, how it's implemented. But on top of that, questions on organizational culture, if the culture fosters integrity, fosters inclusivity, collaboration, accountability, if there's leadership development, if there's succession planning, and how is performance assessed and corrected, if there are retention rates, if there's a big turnover, and if the employees are engaged. I have the sense that the boards don't spend enough time on the organization structure and the culture in the company. So those are always very top priority questions for me to ask.
Yeah, I think they're critically important. Um, I feel like my biggest regret today is I can't talk to you longer because I feel like we've got so much more to cover. And I hope the listeners here realize what a great example Marta is of the quality directors we have engaged in WCD. And Marta, you've been terrific. Your comments have been spot on. You've been wonderful. So thank you so very much for being a part of this today. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, thank you. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you, Cindy. And again, I'm always available for WCD.
Great. Thank you so much.